Okay, welcome everybody to Women Artists in the White House Collection. I'm Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our 55 Plus YouTube channel at a later time for viewing. Through the miracles of modern Zoom technology, I am honored and delighted to introduce Sarah Fling, White House historian, who's going to be telling us a little bit about women artists whose work is on display in the White House, and also about some first ladies who created art over the course of White House history. Sarah Fling has been a historian with the White House Historical Association since 2021. She started as a graduate public research fellow for the association in 2019. Her research, which is quite extensive, and her publications also are quite extensive, focuses on free and enslaved workers, the first ladies, and the White House art collection. She has held several prestigious internships at historical sites, such as George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Frick, Pittsburgh, a cluster of museums and historical buildings in Pittsburgh. She has a BA in history, summa cum laude, from the University of Pittsburgh, and an MA in public history from American University. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. We really appreciate it. I'm going to ask for people to please hold your questions until the end. You're more than welcome to enter them in the chat as we go along, or you're welcome to use the raise hand function in Zoom, or simply unmute yourselves at the end and ask your question in person with the personal touch. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Fling.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you everybody for joining me today. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this topic. And just to give you a little bit of background before I get started. So if you aren't familiar, the White House Historical Association is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was originally founded by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961 for the purpose of sharing the history of the executive mansion with the American people. So I'm excited today to talk about one piece of that and one part of our mission, which is sort of sharing this history of the White House collection. So I want to say that this presentation today is going to take you through a few artists and first ladies, but it's in no way exhaustive. So if you're interested, I encourage you to find more information on the collection at our website, which is whitehousehistory.org, or to save your questions for the very end. Now let's go to the next slide to get started. So to begin with our exploration of the White House collection, I always like to start with the history of the White House collection. The White House has a long history of collecting and displaying impressive fine and decorative arts items. But until the 1960s, there really was no designated caretaker of White House sculpture, chinaware, paintings, furniture, etc. President John Adams was the first president to live in the White House. And when he moved in 1800, the role that we know today of a curator was not really professionalized. So as a result, we instead see various individuals, whether that be first ladies, first daughters, hostesses, and White House staff members taking on some of those responsibilities that we might assign to a curator today. Things like inventories, or the sale of furniture, or the donation and auction of pieces. Without protective protocol in place in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, the White House was also plagued by theft and neglect. And in looking back through history, we can see that many historic pieces were sold, damaged, or lost, which is very unfortunate. In fact, as you can imagine, many saw White House objects as presidential relics or even as souvenirs rather than historical artifacts. So I love this photo on the screen. It's an engraving from the 1860s that shows Union troops quartered in the East Room of the White House during the Civil War. And we know that several of these soldiers took souvenir pieces of carpet or draperies, pulling out their own pocket knives to take a piece of the Lincoln White House with them. Next slide, please. So moving ahead, the process of acquisition and protection under the eye of a hired full-time curator didn't begin until the Kennedy administration. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy was a dedicated preservationist, and she ensured that the souvenir hunting and mismanagement of decades past would not be repeated under her tenure as First Lady. So many changes happened during the Kennedy administration. As I mentioned, one of those changes was that First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy formed the White House Historical Association. She also spearheaded efforts to make the White House an official museum. Today, it is protected by Congress thanks to her efforts, which means that since the 60s, any alterations to public spaces of the White House, that means those spaces that you would see if you were to go on a public tour, like the Blue Room, the East Room, the library, must be approved by the federal government if you want to make a major change. In addition, Mrs. Kennedy hired the first White House curator named Lorraine Waxman Pierce. And Pierce is on the screen here in the photo on the left-hand side, accepting an addition to the White House collection. In 1964, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson signs an executive order that officially establishes the office of the curator, as well as creating something called the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. This is essentially an advisory committee that advises the White House on acquisition efforts and preservation, and it includes some really important, powerful people in the cultural sector, including the White House curator and the White House chief usher, but also the director of the National Gallery of Art, the secretary of the Smithsonian, the head of the National Park Service, and others. So luckily, after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson really wanted to solidify these efforts. So Executive Order 11145 does exactly that. Next slide, please. So now moving ahead to today, thanks to these efforts started by Mrs. Kennedy and solidified by Johnson, the White House collection has more than 65,000 objects that are stored on and off site. Some of those are in the White House and some of them are off site in Maryland. And the collection and preservation of these pieces is far more streamlined. Oh, can we go back one slide? Perfect. New additions are made in every administration, and they're spearheaded by that office of the curator. The curator, as well as several assistant curators and specialists, select paintings and art based on historical and cultural significance. One of the rules that I always like to share is that the artist must be dead more than 25 years in order to be included in the White House collection. And the White House Historical Association assists with the acquisition of works for the collection and the preservation of works by providing funding. So the curator's office also oversees the selection of works for display in public areas of the White House, but then the first family has a little bit more say in what they'd like to see in the private areas. That includes the upstairs second floor area where their bedrooms are, but also the Oval Office, for example. The first family can request loans from major museums to fill these spaces as well, including the Smithsonian, the National Gallery of Art, and the Met. First ladies are very involved in these processes of selecting works and working with the curator's office. So I included this image here of First Lady Laura Bush, who spearheaded the acquisition of this Jacob Lawrence painting as part of her refurbishment of the Green Room in 2007. Now, next slide, please. Now I'd like to sort of segment this into categories. So I'm going to start by talking about women who were portraitists at the White House. And of course, portraits are one of the most memorable parts of the White House collection. This photograph shows the White House unveiling of First Lady Bess Truman's portrait, which was painted by GRETA KEMPTON. And we'll talk about that a bit in a moment. But let's go to the next slide and move chronologically through this story of female portraitists. So the first being Harriet A.S. Murphy, because she was the first woman commissioned to paint the White House portrait of a president. Harriet Murphy was a self-taught painter who was born in England and later moved to the United States. And upon moving to the US, she married a fellow artist named William D. Murphy. Now, Harriet was smart. She realized that because of her gender, she was making less money and earning less commissions. So instead, she began to paint under her husband's name. And I love this quote from the New York Times that says, when Mr. Murphy discovered that his wife's work was better than his own, he abandoned his own artwork and became her business agent. So thanks to painting under the initials W.D. Murphy, Harriet then was earning more money and more commissions for her work. She went on to paint several prominent Americans, including Presidents William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. But the portrait here, of course, is of William McKinley, and it was actually painted by Murphy after his assassination in 1901. So this was done in 1902 using photographs and previous artistic portrayals. And she was actually selected from a competition. She beat 4 male artists to win the commission from the White House. So this is especially impressive in this period when women were really excluded from the fine arts. Let's head to the next slide. Because as the century went on, presidential portraits painted by women became more prevalent. And one of these women is Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF, who painted 2 American presidents and a first lady in her lifetime. Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF was born in present-day Ukraine, at the time Russia, and took art lessons as a child. Her family left Russia following the October Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and resettled in the United States. She started a family, but unfortunately, her husband unexpectedly passed. And so as a result, Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF turned her artistic hobby from her youth into a full-time career in order to support her children and herself. Luckily, she was very talented and she became a well-known painter, specifically of high society New Yorkers. And it was through this connection that she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had formerly been in New York government, and she painted a miniature of him in 1943. Now, we believe that FDR liked this so much that he then invited her to paint a full-size portrait of him at his Warm Springs, Georgia vacation home. FDR often traveled to Warm Springs for his polio treatment and spent a lot of time there. Now, FDR sat for a watercolor portrait with Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF on April 12, 1945. And if you're a presidential history buff, that date might sound familiar, because in the middle of their sitting, as Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF is painting FDR, he suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage and died only a few hours later. So Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF's portrait was incomplete, and you can see it on the screen here. It still hangs in Warm Springs. Later, during the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, the president invited Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF to complete another finished version of this FDR portrait to hang in the White House. And then later, Johnson commissioned her to paint both his official White House portrait and Lady Bird Johnson. So let's go to the next slide so we can see those paintings. So here on the left-hand side, you can see that completed version of Elizabeth SHOUMATOFF's painting of FDR. This was actually painted from memory. That's very impressive, about 20 years later. And then the paintings of the Johnsons here were completed through in-person sittings at the White House and at their Texas ranch. And something I always like to add, an interesting tidbit, is that Lyndon B. Johnson really saw FDR as a mentor because in so many ways, FDR's New Deal program influenced Lyndon Johnson's Great Society vision for America of fighting poverty, providing infrastructure. And so as a result, he wanted to sort of channel his admiration for FDR by selecting the same portrait artist. And that's part of the reason that he wanted SHOUMATOFF to complete his portrait. Let's go to the next slide. Here's Greta KEMPTON, who I mentioned earlier, painting the portrait of the Trumans. Greta KEMPTON was also born abroad in Austria and learned to paint as a young woman. And then, like the others we've discussed, moved to the United States as a young woman. She became an art student in New York and once again made a name for herself by slowly rising in the ranks and painting prominent individuals, specifically politicians. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman commissioned his presidential portrait from KEMPTON. And for the rest of her career, she really sort of serves as a court painter for the Truman family. She painted Harry Truman, Bess Truman, and their daughter Margaret, and even turned down opportunities to paint other US presidents out of loyalty to the Trumans. In particular, Martha Greta KEMPTON's likeness of Truman rose in popularity because it was used for several prominent publications and commemorations, for example, campaign posters, commemorative postage stamps, and coins. So you can see it on the screen here. Margaret Truman, Harry Truman's daughter, is standing with Greta Kempton in 1948. Let's go to the next slide. So our next category is going to expand into broader artwork in the White House collection that includes women sculptors and painters. And I think you'll probably be familiar with a few of the women that I'm going to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. And we'll begin with Mary Cassatt, who is a prominent 19th and 20th century painter, and she's particularly known for being the only American included in the French School of Impressionist painters. So Mary Cassatt, even though she's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, exhibits her work in Paris alongside artists like Degas, Monet, and Renoir. And then she brings them back to the United States, really popularizing Impressionist work among Americans. She is especially known for her depictions of domestic life, motherhood, and children. And one of her works in the White House collection, called Young Mother and Two Children, came to the White House during the Johnson administration in 1965. And let's go to the next slide to see that work. You can see it on the left-hand side here. It's very characteristic of Mary Cassatt because you see this impressionist hue, these blues and greens, this nature, as well as, of course, motherhood and children. And then I also included this wonderful image of Lyndon Johnson's daughter and granddaughter, Linda Bird Johnson Robb and Lucinda Robb. And she's standing directly in front of Young Mother and Two Children. I think it's a great reminder that the White House is both a museum and a home. Next slide, please. Now, another painter that we have that I think you've probably all heard of is Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was a well-known modernist painter that's included in the White House collection. And in particular, Georgia O'Keeffe was known for her depictions of flowers and of New Mexico landscapes. And both of these have been featured in the White House at different times. So let's go to the next slide to see those works. During the George W. Bush administration, O'Keeffe's floral painting, Jimson Weed White Flower No. 1, came to the White House on loan, and it hung in the president's dining room. You can see that on the left-hand side. So as I mentioned, private areas of the White House, like the president's dining room, are able to really be up to the personal choices of a president and first lady. They were fans, the Bushes, of Georgia O'Keeffe, and for that reason, they requested the loan of this floral work. Then the White House collection also has an O'Keeffe painting in the permanent collection, and that's Mountain at Bear Lake House, which is on the right-hand side here. It was painted by Georgia O'Keeffe in 1930, and it was acquired by the White House in 1997 during the Clinton administration. Next slide, please. Here you can see Mountain at Bear Lake House in the White House Library hanging. It's a really interesting piece. It's very reflective of Georgia O'Keeffe. It depicts land near Taos, New Mexico, which is a sacred area to the Taos indigenous people. And as she does in many of these New Mexico works, she employs shifting light and deep colors and these sort of abstract outlines to really share the haunting beauty of the desert. Let's go to the next slide. And now we'll see one of my favorite artists that's included in the White House collection, and that's Alma Thomas, who is, of course, a Washington, D.C. local and the first Black woman represented in the White House collection. Now, Alma Thomas was the very first fine arts graduate of Howard University. She graduated in 1924, and she spent most of her life teaching art in Washington, D.C.'s public school. She was a public school art teacher. It actually wasn't until she was in her 70s and in her retirement that Thomas became well known. This was in the 1960s. And she was particularly known for being a member of the Washington, D.C. Color School, which is a group of abstract expressionists known for their work with colorful shapes. So this photo of Alma Thomas is great, but it's in black and white, so we can't really get a good taste of her love of color. So let's go to the next slide and see her work at the White House, which is Resurrection. And I just think it's such a joyful, colorful piece. It was painted by Alma Thomas in 1966, and it came to the White House during the Obama administration. Once again, this is the president's dining room, that private space. And it was unveiled by the Obamas for Black History Month, because as I mentioned, this is the very first piece by a Black woman in the White House collection. Let's go to the next slide. So now we'll move away from paintings and go to, let's go back one. There we go, perfect. We'll highlight a sculptor, a woman sculptor featured in the collection named Adelaide Johnson. And Adelaide Johnson is really a bit of a character. She's a fascinating woman, and her life story is really interesting to me. She was originally from Illinois, and she trained as both an artist and a woodworker at the St. Louis School of Design. And then as a young woman, she moved to Chicago. She hoped to further her education at the Chicago School of Art, which was one of the preeminent schools for art in the country. But unfortunately, just as she was about to enroll at the Chicago School of Art, she lost her tuition money when she was pickpocketed. She thought certainly this was the end of her artistic career, but luckily a freak accident saved her. She fell down an empty elevator shaft, and the insurance settlement for that accident provided $15,000. Now, this is a lot of money in the mid-19th century. She used that money to study art in Europe, and when she came back to the United States, she became one of the best-known sculptors of the period. In particular, she became a proud supporter of women's rights, and she sculpted a number of prominent American suffragists. She really became known as the suffrage sculptor. If you've ever visited the US Capitol Rotunda, her most famous work is there. It's called A Portrait Monument to Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. Now, the work that we have in the White House collection is right here on the left-hand side. It's a bronze bust of Susan B. Anthony, and it came to the White House during the Nixon administration as a nod to Nixon's work in appointing more women into government positions. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the final category that I'm going to talk about with you all today is first ladies and art. Many first ladies were artists or art collectors, and of course, even more than that, have been supporters of arts and culture throughout their time in the White House. So because they're such an important part of this White House history, I'd like to share some of those stories with you all today. Let's head to the next slide. We'll begin with Harriet Lane. She was a White House hostess and the niece of President James Buchanan. I actually wrote my thesis in graduate school about Harriet Lane because she's a really interesting woman. Despite the fact that the average American today has not heard of Harriet Lane, she was really quite a celebrity during her time in the White House. She was very popular, she was youthful, she even would sign autographs when she went out and about because she was so well known. It's interesting because Buchanan is one of the least popular presidents. Harriet Lane was also very interested in the arts, and she began collecting art while she lived in the White House. After the end of the Buchanan administration, she continued her art collecting, traveling Europe and dedicating time and energy to really building this collection. When she died in 1903, she willed her collection toward, quote, the creation of a national gallery of art. Now, today in Washington, D.C., of course, there is a National Gallery of Art, but in 1903, no such institution existed. So instead, it fell under the control of the Smithsonian Institution, and her collection of paintings, sculptures, and Buchanan artifacts became the foundation and the impetus to create the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Let's go to the next slide. You can see an image here of the Harriet Lane Johnston Room at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 1922. And the Smithsonian today still lovingly refers to her as the First Lady of the National Collection of Fine Arts. And you can even see there's some Buchanan paintings included in this collection. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to first ladies and art, Caroline Harrison was one of the most active artists to live in the White House, the wife of Benjamin Harrison. Mrs. Harrison was incredibly artistic. She studied art and music in school, getting a degree from the Oxford Female Institute, and she later took lessons in Indianapolis, Indiana, from artist Paul Putsky. In her Indiana home, she gave her own lessons when she became quite successful as an artist, and she established a studio. We also know that she exhibited her art in local Indianapolis exhibitions. She continued these pursuits when she moved into the White House in 1889, and she even invited congressional and cabinet wives to come take lessons from her at the White House. She was so passionate about art that she even proposed the addition of an entirely new wing on the White House to house an art gallery. And although this never happened, I always love to imagine what it would be like to have an entire art wing on the White House. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of her works. As you can tell, she was quite talented. Mrs. Harrison loved watercolors, she loved china painting, and she loved flowers. So this is really an amalgamation of all of those things. She even helped to design the Harrison White House China Service. And this photograph, which is depicting the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Sites collection of her orchid tea set, is featuring orchids, which we know were her favorite flower, and that she would go into the White House Conservatory and sit and get inspiration from the orchid room there. Next slide, please. At the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site, they also have a collection of her watercolor supplies, which you can see on the left-hand side in this mahogany box. And then I included this image of the proposed White House expansion that she had. So one of those wings would have been the American Art Gallery wing. And you could probably tell by looking at it why it never came to fruition. It was quite expensive and a bit palatial for the subdued American tastes, a little monarchical for the American president, but quite grand and interesting to think about what it would have been like if the White House looked like this. Next slide. Now, the last First Lady that I'll talk about today is Ellen Wilson, who was the only First Lady that was a professional artist, meaning that she sold her work for a profit. So Ellen Wilson moved into the White House. She was the first wife of Woodrow Wilson in 1913, and she had been trained in Georgia and later in New York City. In fact, as a teenager, she had exhibited her work internationally and even won a bronze prize at the Paris International Exposition. Like Mary Cassatt, she was an impressionist painter, and she later exhibited her work in one-woman art shows and even lived in an artistic colony in the American Northeast for a time. When Woodrow Wilson was elected, she set up an art studio at the White House, and she continued to sell her paintings for a profit. But as First Lady, she did not feel that it was right for her to keep those profits. So instead, she donated the money to the Martha Berry School for Underprivileged Girls in her hometown of Rome, Georgia. And I love this quote from the delineator that says, "She has a high talent as a landscape painter, not the kind of thing that goes with a few well-decorated china plates, but a real big artistic talent." Let's go to the next slide and we'll see one of her works. So this is Princeton Landscape. It's in the White House collection, and it's very representative of her impressionist art style. It's focused around landscapes and nature, and it depicts Princeton, New Jersey, where the Wilsons lived while Woodrow Wilson was working at Princeton University. Many other First Ladies, of course, have supported the arts throughout the history of the White House, bringing music, theater, ballet, and fine arts to the executive mansion, assisting with the acquisition of works, as I shared earlier, and encouraging general art appreciation. But that's all I have for you. We can go to the final slide. And I really appreciate all of your attention today. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Do we have any? I don't see any in the chat just yet. I have a question to start us off with, maybe.
Sure.
Then people will be more brave. You had mentioned that the paintings couldn't be by an artist unless the artist had been dead for 25 years. What is the reason behind that?
That's a great question. So from my understanding, the main reason for that delineation is to keep presidents from being able to have a political relationship with an artist that could be reciprocated by having a piece in the White House. So it's able to ensure that there are no personal relationships impacting what comes in and out of the collection. But at the same time, I think that back to the point, as I mentioned, the curator's office also looks for pieces that they believe have had an impact on American art and culture. And so to be able to really ensure that things have had an impact lasting beyond their years, it also provides that sort of hindsight of looking back and seeing how an artist's work has shaped American art.
Thank you so much for that. We have something in the chat now. Kate says, fabulous talk. Where is all the art stored?
Great question. So throughout history, a lot of the art in the White House had just been sort of stored here and there in the basement or in the attic. But since now there is a curator's office, there is museum grade storage, some of which is at the White House, but a large majority of it is in a huge warehouse out in Maryland. It's temperature controlled, it's cataloged, so you know exactly where to find things. So that's all offsite. As you can imagine, 65,000 objects can't all fit in one small executive mansion. Although admittedly, I will just add that the reason that number is so high is that a lot of it are presidential China services, which number up each of them is 2,000 to 3,000 pieces, including cutlery, cups, plates. So that's why that number is so large.
Wonderful.
I have a question about the Harriet Lane and her decision to donate everything to a national gallery, and because the National Gallery did not exist, it went to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, or what was, you know, original version of it. But anyway, so does that art still reside with the American Art Museum?
It does. It's still in the collection, and some of it, if you go, you know, it's attached to the National Portrait Gallery. If you go to their location in Chinatown, you can see that there are pieces hanging there that will have Harriet Lane's name in the bequest area.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yes.
What is the beautiful painting behind you?
So this is actually, I'm going the wrong way. So we recently, in the last, I want to say 15 years or so, commissioned a local artist, Peter Waddell, to do some artistic depictions of things that we don't have photographs of in the White House. So for example, this is a depiction based on his research of what the Blue Room would have looked like during the Cleveland administration. So he did sort of a series of paintings for us, and we have the physical paintings hanging here in our headquarters in Decatur House, but you can see all of them on our whitehousehistory.org website if you're interested in learning more.
And we have another question in the chat. Is there a book about these women artists, or is it best to look online?
That is another great question. We do have some publications that deal with art at the White House. One of them is just simply called Art in the White House, that goes through each of the pieces in the White House collection, but it's not really focused on the artists and the women. It's sort of just an overview of all of the pieces, but we have different articles on our website that focus on each of these people. There's an article we have on Harriet Lane. We have some on Georgia O'Keeffe and Alma Thomas. So if you're interested in learning more, check out our website probably first.
Okay, that takes care of the chat questions. I'm just going to look to see if anyone has their hands raised.
I have one more question.
Great.
What percentage of the art is on loan and what belongs to the White House collection?
That's a good question. And, you know, unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head, because as presidents come to the White House, the loans change. So since we've relatively recently had a new president come in, the information about loans, I'm not so sure. But I will just say that any of those public areas of the White House, those are almost entirely things from the White House collection. The things that are on loan are mostly items that you would see in the Oval Office or in the residence.
Well, for example, that Alma Thomas one, is that still in the White House, or is that?
It is. So any of the things that I showed today are in the collection, and those items, as I mentioned, they're protected by Congress. They cannot leave the White House if they're in the White House collection. They will either be there or be in storage. The Alma Thomas painting, since it's such a beloved piece, is always on display in the public areas of the White House. There are a few others that are really popular, and so they never move their positions. A good example is the very famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, for example. Those pieces are always there. They're not moving around.
Right, thank you.
Okay, just looking for some more questions. I mean, feel free to just unmute yourselves and ask it. When you go on oh, here's a question. This is such an inspiring talk. I'll head over to the Smithsonian American Art Museum this week.
Please do, Kate. I hope you enjoy.
When you take a White House tour, do they point out the artworks?
Oh, this is a good question, actually. If you ever get a chance, this is a little tip for you. So when you do a tour of the White House, it is not guided, but a lot of people don't know this. The Secret Service officers that work in the White House that you see if you do a tour are very knowledgeable, and they have the answers to a lot of questions about what's on display at the White House. So if you're ever on a public tour and you see something and you have a question, try asking one of the Secret Service officers, because they look at them all day. They actually are trained to know a lot of this information, and so they love answering questions about the art. So if you get a chance to go, and the tours are open to the public finally again just in the last few weeks, try asking them about some of those pieces.
Do you ever give tours?
We don't give tours of the White House because they are not guided tours, unfortunately, and you still have to go through the process of talking to your congressman or representative to get into the White House. But we do give tours if you're in the DC area and you're interested in coming to Decatur House. We're headquartered here at Decatur House. We're on Lafayette Square. It's the historic home of Commodore Stephen Decatur, and we do tours of Decatur House every Monday, and they're free to the public. So they're at 10:30 and 1.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Maybe we can arrange that. Another question in the chat. Have any new pieces been added in the current administration?
Great question. So to my knowledge, we have not added any pieces to the White House collection, those permanent pieces. The last thing that was added to the White House collection was a new sculpture that was unveiled in the Rose Garden in 2020 by First Lady Melania Trump. It's by Isamu Noguchi, and it's called Floor Frame. And that's actually the first piece of art in the White House collection by an Asian American artist. So we were very excited about that. So that was the last piece that we added to the collection. However, new pieces are added every administration. So there will be something added in the coming years, I'm sure. It's just a process of, finding pieces that they're interested in adding, negotiating loans and donations and funding for those pieces. So something will inevitably be added during the Biden administration. Nothing has been added permanently yet. Of course, the Bidens did bring in loans and decorated the Oval Office and the residence to their liking. So things changed in that way.
Do you do the Christmas ornaments? That's from the White House Historical Association?
We do. So every year, actually 100% of the funds from the Christmas ornament goes towards these projects of preserving the White House. So every year we move chronologically through the presidents. And then this year is our Nixon ornament. It is a gingerbread house because the Nixons were the first to institute the tradition of having a White House gingerbread house during the holidays. So we do those every year, and we get to explore the history of each of those administrations as we move through them.
Great. We have another question in the chat about whether you know what was added to the collection during the Obama administration.
Yes, great question. So for example, that Alma Thomas painting, Resurrection, that was added during the Obama administration. That's probably the best example. Then during the Obama administration, another good example is that the official White House portraits of President George Bush and Laura Bush were added to the White House collection. So those were unveiled by the Obamas and added. Off the top of my head, those are some good examples, but there were a few things that were added because of having two terms. There's more time for additions to the White House.
Does every president get a China set, or how does it get decided when they're ready for a new one?
Yeah, good question. So not every president gets a China set. Typically, China services are only commissioned for presidents who have had 2 terms. That's mostly because they're very expensive to make and take a really long time, to be honest, to design and make. And so 4 years is not enough. So in looking back, 2-term presidents are typically the presidents that have had China services. The last China service we made, because we commissioned the China pieces at the White House Historical Association, was for the Obamas.
It must be quite an honor to get to design that, I would imagine.
And the first ladies and presidents are very involved in that process of sort of putting their personal touch on the China services. For example, the Obamas made it that beautiful teal blue color as a nod to Hawaii. But you sort of see those personal touches in each of them. The Reagan China, for example, was Reagan red, as is Nancy Reagan's favorite color. So you really see the personalities of the first family come through in those designs.
It's fabulous. Okay, anybody else have a question? I don't see any more in the chat, but please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. We'd love to hear from you. No, I guess they're going to be shy. Going once, twice. Okay, well, I guess you've answered everybody's questions.
I know it's a lot to process, a lot of information.
This was fabulous, really fascinating. I really appreciate this, Sarah. This is, you know so much about it, and it's just fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us, for letting us know all about these women artists in the collection, and about famous first ladies who created.
Of course.
This has been fascinating. And
thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you to all our 55+ participants who joined us today. We're delighted. Enjoy the rest of your day. Everybody be well. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.